All right. All right, Tony, let's see, we're live. So I'm gonna start announcements at the front and then do a couple welcomes and then, yeah, we'll be up. I'll switch over, Tony, whenever we get to your part. All right, good evening, everybody. How we doing? Doing well on this Tuesday. Survived a little bit of chilly weather and Texas being temperamental, of course. My name is Brian Tony. I am an organizer with the Dallas Housing Coalition. Is this anybody's first event with the Dallas Housing Coalition? Sweet, more than half the room. That's something that we love to see, considering we are a fairly new nonprofit. Not working. So if you haven't heard of us, we launched in June of 2023 with 65 members of for-profit and nonprofit organizations. And we represent community-based groups, neighborhood-level organizations. We also have nonprofit, for-profit developers and community development corporations. And we pride ourselves in being a diverse big tent. So if you're not already a member, you'll have an opportunity to become a member at the end of today's event. There are also QR codes here and ways to get involved through our social media. We started off with a $200 million bond campaign for attainable housing and homelessness. We ended up getting about 83 million, which is still more than Dallas has ever dedicated to housing through Propositions G, H, and I, which are now being used by the city to partner with developers and provide more mixed income housing across our multifamily rental and for home ownership. So we're monitoring those dollars now. And as soon as the bond passed, basically in May of 2024, we started looking ahead to Forward Dallas, which was our comprehensive land use plan update. There was a lot of discussion on how do we accommodate new growth as a city while also preserving and taking care of our existing housing stock in our residents and communities. Thankfully, that was adopted by City Council by an 11-4 vote. And Forward Dallas 2.0, Director Emily Lewis here from Planning and Development, thank you for being here, Emily, is working on implementing that in phases. And we're continuing to be in touch with them on how do we create more missing middle housing, how do we make sure that our areas that are rapidly gentrifying are being identified, and that we're putting solutions in place so that Dallas can continue to both grow. Our mission, of course, is both creation and preservation of attainable housing in the city of Dallas for all, meaning people of all income levels, all stages of life can find the housing that they need at a price point that's attainable to them. And now we're working on parking reform, which is what brings you here today. Our members have said that and have made the connection between parking costs and development, which we're going to hear from two amazing speakers talk about today, and affordability. And these conversations are happening in real time through the City Planning Commission right now, and then eventually will be going on to the City Council. And so I'll talk more about next steps after you hear from our presenters. This is, of course, our flyer from today. We've got Tony Jordan, president of the Parking Reform Network. They're a national organization that identifies where parking reform is happening across the 82 cities in the country we'll talk about, I'm sure, even more internationally, who've adopted progressive parking policies and updated our ordinances that are out of date. And then also on the line is Felicity Maxwell, and she's based in the city of Austin. So we have two virtual speakers, which is why we're, have got all these wires and audio situations, but they are able to, one, hear us, and we're going to, two, be able to hear them. And Tony, while you get your screen shared, I'm going to invite Louis Luckhart to the front he's our, why we're here, our host today. And I'll like Louis to introduce himself and talk about why the AFL-CIO is a member of the Dallas Housing Coalition. So please join me in thanking Louis for hosting us today.
First of all, let me welcome you to what is known around town as the House of Labor, which is the CWA Hall, Union Hall. And I represent the Dallas Central Labor Council, which is a federation of 38 different unions that we all work together on issues, and housing is one of the issues that we were very interested in. Our members, we have almost 20,000 members, affiliates in our Central Labor Council, and the majority of them do not live in Dallas. They work in Dallas, produce products in Dallas, but unfortunately, housing is not something they can attain with the price of housing. So that's why we were very interested in joining this coalition, see if we could work on that kind of a problem. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Yeah, give it up for the. So we are live streaming on all of our social media channels, Instagram, X, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So you can share this video and the great content you're about to hear from Tony and Felicity after the event today. Tony, you're ready to go. I'm going to hit the lights so y'all can see the front screen, and then look forward to your presentation, Tony. After Tony, Felicity will talk about lessons learned from Austin, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A and discussion. That sound good? All right. Yep. Tony, the floor is yours.
And my presentation is showing?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Tony Jordan. I live in Portland, Oregon. I am the president of the Parking Reform Network. I actually, I didn't realize this till just now hearing the previous introduction, but I was an organizer for CWA Local 919 in California for a number of years, organizing university professional and technical employees. And labor organizing is a lot of the skills I learned as a labor organizer I apply regularly to parking reform. So it's great to be speaking in a union hall for a union that I worked for. So I'm going to talk to you about parking reform. Let's get to it. Hold on, let me make sure I can actually move my slides. Okay, there we go. The first thing here is kind of a little warning, right? Like, I didn't start out, as I mentioned, I was a union organizer. I didn't start out as a parking reformer. I wasn't a planner. I just picked up a book like 12 or 15 years ago that really blew my mind. And it blew my mind because I realized that how much of our cities were taken up by parking and how much that parking cost and how it got there. And it really, you know, it changed the whole trajectory of my life. And if I do a good job today, I warn you, you might become slightly obsessed and work on this topic more than you might think yourself. It's kind of like if you've seen They Live, when Roddy Piper puts on these magic glasses and sees the world is run by, you know, kind of monstrous alien beings. I can't look at a parking lot anymore and not see the dollars that it costs to build it. I look at it, I see the space it takes up. I see kind of like the ghosts of what was maybe there before. But I also think I see the promise of what could be there if we reform these rules. And so that's hopefully the message I'm going to give to you today. What is the Parking Reform Network? Briefly, as mentioned, we're a nonprofit organization. We're national/international in scope, mostly in the U.S. We've got more than, you know, somewhere between, depending on the day, 600 and 700 members. We have a couple of staff. We work as an advocacy organization, just supporting advocates, academics, professionals around the country on this policy. And we're here to talk about the parking problem. If you ask a normal person, what's the parking problem? I shouldn't say normal person, but an everyday person, you know, they will probably tell you, I can't find a place to park or parking costs too much, but that's actually not what the real parking problem is. The real parking problem is for 70 years, we have required a bunch of parking in all of our cities across the United States, and that has led to higher costs, more traffic, more pollution, less housing, more sedentary lifestyles, a whole host of problems. And this kind of starts with the original sin, which is parking mandates, minimum parking requirements. And I want to emphasize, I'll say this a number of times, but the reforms we're asking for to get rid of these mandates don't prevent parking from being built, and they don't require parking to be removed. But we do have rules across the country in the zoning code that say if you want to start a certain kind of business or build a home, you have to build a certain amount of parking. And I think that people think, I know because I've read some of the local news around covering this policy reform, that people think that these rules came from somewhere, that they mean something, that if it's in the city zoning code, it's probably based on some fact. And I'm here to show you it is not. So my favorite examples here is bowling alleys. If you want to build the bowling alley in almost any city in the United States, there you have to look up in the table and figure out how much parking you need per lane, and it varies widely. I do surveys of about 20 cities near the area where I'm giving a talk, in this case, Dallas, and invariably I will find a spread between about 2 spaces per lane, as in Denton, to 6, 7, or in Dallas, since a bowling lane takes up about 1,000 square feet, 10 spaces per lane, right? And so really, what is the difference when you look at a bowler in Denton or Prosper versus a bowler in Hazlet or Dallas, right? Like probably not much, certainly not enough to require 5 times as much parking in a bowling alley in Dallas as there might be in Denton, or 3 times as much as there might be in Prosper. These rules are arbitrary. Another example I looked at here was banks. So you have just these very specific differences. If you want to build a bank, how much parking do you need? Well, 200, one per 200 square feet, one per 250, 300, 333. You can really just see that these are pretty arbitrary numbers. They are localized, but there's not. I would be hard pressed for anyone. You could ask any city planner why Dallas requires one per 333 and Prosper would be 350. And the fact is there's no reason. Planners might as well have been using tarot cards, reading bird guts, throwing darts at a board, to come up with these numbers, and that would be fine, except they got written into the zoning code, and they've impacted our cities greatly. And I wanted to mention, actually, I should have said up front, there's this. I go into this a lot because I really want to emphasize how arbitrary these mandates are, and I try to make it a bit funny because the real sad news comes after, and then we have some hope later in my presentation. We know that these rules are arbitrary because we can look back to the 50s when they were being put into place and read from the planners who were suggesting them that they couldn't agree on how much parking there should be in a shopping center. There's not a correct answer. Invariably, they guess a number of stalls and it's either too much or not enough. And that's fine if you're the person building a shopping center and you're putting your money on the line and you're guessing how much parking it is. But when that gets written into the city zoning code and impacts generations of people trying to live and work in a place, that's no longer good. These are ridiculous. These are I'm gonna give you 2 examples I find funny. In Gilbert, Arizona, there's a parking mandate for haunted houses. In cemeteries, there's parking requirements for them around the country, but I recently discovered one in Carver, Massachusetts, one for every 8 occupants. Like, that's pretty bizarre. But Dallas might take the crown here. I looked at Dallas zoning code before, but there are 220 different land uses in the Dallas zoning code, each with their own parking requirement. So, and each with very specific definitions of the land use and specific other rules, not just parking. So this is, it's kind of a very restrictive policy. And here's an example of them. I couldn't help myself. I had to overload this slide, but you're talking from wax museums, drive-in movie theaters. These are all in the Dallas City zoning code today. Why do you need a parking requirement for a drive-in theater? I don't know. Gummed label printing, which is different than custom printing. Taxidermist, passenger bus station. I mean, overnight shelter, 1 space for every 1,000 beds in the shelter. I mean, and then helicopter base, heliport, helistop, 3 helicopter related land uses with different parking requirements. What's the difference? Hell if I know. So it's funny, but it's not a laughing matter. These are in your zoning code, and that's kind of the DNA of your city, and they impact it in terrible ways. We have places that are arguably easy to get to if you drive there, but then you don't want to be there because they're big parking lots that are hot or just sprawly or unpleasant. It makes it hard to walk from one place to another. It's noisy. So these rules have, as comical as they might be when you look at them one on one, they really do express themselves in a bad way. One of those ways that they express themselves is in the cost. Parking is expensive, and most people don't know how expensive. So a surface space, not including the land, is usually between $5,000 and $10,000 a stall. Above ground parking, you might find it for 30,000, but more recently, it's probably 40, $50,000 a stall. And going below ground doubles the cost. A rule of thumb, someone's got to pay this, and a rule of thumb is that for every $10,000 in construction cost, you're looking at $100 in rent that needs to be paid. This is real money that has real impacts. How we decide to spend our money in our cities expresses our values. So in Stamford, Connecticut, one of the most wealthy places in the country, they have a park and ride parking garage they built that has about 900 parking spaces and it costs $90 million. So that's $88,000 so someone can drive to the parking garage and take the train, probably to New York. In the same city, they have a apartment, deeply affordable, permanently affordable housing, no ongoing subsidy required. It cost about $9 million to build in subsidies, and it houses about 120 people, not 120 apartments, but about 120 people. So for $77,000 a person, they could house a person in Stamford, Connecticut versus $88,000 to park a car. And this is an extreme, maybe an extreme example, but if you dig, you can find these examples all across the country. These stories are everywhere. Another big part of the problem with the parking is how much space it takes up. Parking space is 300 to 400 square feet. So it leads to sprawl. You're looking at automobile scale versus human scale. These are two churches in Dallas, and one is a church that was most likely built before parking mandates, and it's got a parking lot, and it's integrated someone into the neighborhood. And then you have probably a newer church that's built with a more modern parking lot, and you could just see the difference in how these things present to people who might live in the neighborhood or going to them. One is telling you drive to me, and one is telling you you can walk to me. Modern commercial activity, right? You have modern commercial is probably a single land use with a lot of parking around it, whereas the types of neighborhoods we built in the past have a lot of spaces you can park once and walk to, or walk to from where you live. Auto-oriented versus pedestrian-oriented. Just even the scale, all of these pictures are at the same scale, by the way. These are all the same size, one side to the other. So you're talking about shopping mall scale versus more compact neighborhood scale. And just look at the difference in how these things look and feel, and think about where, you'd rather live or work or shop if you had the choice, recognizing that, there are impacts about where people live. But if you could choose, most people would choose the more pedestrian oriented place to live or recreate. I'm going to pick on your parking requirements one more time, at least. This is a sewage treatment plant on the left, and it's your water treatment plant on the right. And this is the same scale again, and they look pretty much the same, but let's zoom in and see that the wastewater treatment plant has a giant parking lot with more than 100 parking spaces, 150 parking spaces. And the water treatment plant has about 20 or so, and there's about the same number of cars parked in them on the day the satellite took the image. Dallas, for some reason, has required its own sewage treatment plant to have one parking space per million gallons of capacity, and that sewage treatment plant happens to have 160 million gallons of capacity. Whereas a water treatment plant inexplicably just requires two. That's just two spaces. And I put this here to really emphasize that even though there's only two spaces required, did the water treatment plant builders only build two spaces? Of course not. They know how many parking spaces they needed a water treatment plant, and they built them. Clearly, they built more than 20. Whereas on the other side, the city, for some reason, has told the wastewater treatment plant it has to build 160 spaces. And so they built them whether they need them or not, at the cost of the taxpayer, probably. And, there's just more wastewater to manage, I suppose, every time it rains. This space has an impact on housing. One or two parking spaces can take up the same space as an apartment. And when you look at multifamily requirements in the region, they range from around 1.5 per studio, 1 per bedroom in Dallas, plus some guest parking, 2 per 2 bedroom. And those might seem reasonable until you look at, like, what does the community potentially need for multifamily housing? In the entire Metroplex, renter households, 9% of them own no vehicle or have no vehicle available, and 52% have one vehicle. So you're looking at more than 60% in the Metroplex have, one car or less. And even when you look at all households combined, you're really still 39% have one vehicle or less. Now, I know Dallas, I've been told, is a car-centric place, but lo and behold, 68% of renter households in Dallas own one car or fewer, and more than half of all households in Dallas own one car or fewer. So when you're requiring those parking spaces that, for a studio, one space, or for a one bedroom apartment, one and a half or two parking spaces, you're really requiring people. Remember, I mentioned an above ground parking space might cost $400 or $500 a month. You're requiring these households that might be a single parent or just a single person or someone, to pay this extra parking. And I want to, there's often a lot of questions of who these people are. There's this fantastic book by a woman, Anna Zivarts, called When Driving is Not an Option. The people who, there's often said, hey, you can't live in this neighborhood without a car. And the fact is that there are people living in those neighborhoods right now without cars because they're children, because they're elderly, because they can't afford a car, or they have no driver's license, maybe for a legal reason, or they can't drive for a medical issue. A lot of people with disabilities actually can't drive. So I highly recommend looking at this book and really understanding that these people are in the communities, and what we're talking about is providing options for them to live. We can dig more into this. We did a webinar on aging and disability. As people age, the AARP supports parking reform because they know that people, when they reach later in their life, they want to live in close-knit communities. They want to live by their family and by support, and they often don't want to drive or can't drive at night, for example. So this is actually allowing these places to be built is a very friendly thing to do. Just briefly, often you'll hear the transit is not good enough, and that may be true, but once again, there are already people living in those areas with the transit that's provided. And I would like to just point out that if your barrier is that the transit has to be good before you allow housing to be built, then you're basically, because it takes a long time for housing to be built, you're asking for people to subsidize transit for a long time before there's actual ridership. And that's kind of backwards. I think we can let things be done in an organic fashion. These rules have led to a lot of parking. Our downtowns are hollowed out by them. We have a whole set of parking maps. The QR code would show you where we showed downtowns and how much parking there is. Dallas itself, downtown, about 27% of the buildable lots in the central city are parking. That's not super great. I won't dwell on this too much, but I want to point out that actually this is often a best case scenario for a commercial district. 27% of a downtown is a lot, but when you look back again at a modern shopping center, that is a lot more parking actually than is in the downtown. And part of the reason we don't see redevelopment, at least my theory, in these downtowns is because when you're building, the rest of your city or your suburbs are requiring this parking and car dependency. It's very difficult to redevelop those places. And part of the reason it's also difficult to redevelop is because you don't have good infrastructure and services. We know that building more compact and walkable places that are slightly more dense or even a little more dense, but we're not talking skyscrapers in a single family neighborhood dense. You can make a lot more tax revenue to support services for constituents and support the infrastructure that makes it possible to live more walkable lifestyles. There's environmental impacts, obviously, climate change impacted by driving, but there's a lot of real just basic on the ground conservation issues too. Urban heating. I've been in Dallas in hot days, and parking lots are a difficult place to be in that time. It leads to nighttime heating as well. Also, runoff and water pollution is a big thing. I know that I understand that soils, there's runoff issues, and so when you're requiring more stuff to be paved, you're leading to downstream water quality and flooding issues in the city. So right before we get to some solutions, parking mandates that you have right now undermine a lot of goals. Common goals that we have all over the place. We want less traffic. We want people to have active options. We want more housing. We want to reduce our pollution. We want economic vitality. And the parking we have now supports all that traffic. When we build more stuff for cars, we're diverting money that you could have for transit. More parking definitely means less housing. These are contributors to runoff, GHG, urban heating, and parking mandates are a barrier to entry for small entrepreneurs, and they lead to poor tax performance. Fortunately, there's some solutions. My mentor, Donald Shoup, a professor at UCLA, wrote a book a long time ago called The High Costs of Free Parking, and in it, there is a doctrine of 3 solutions. Eliminate your parking mandates, price your curbs, manage your curbs well, and use that money to reduce auto dependency or improve the local area. The first thing Brian mentioned up front, getting rid of your parking mandates is sweeping the nation and the world. There are at least 82 U.S. cities that have gotten rid of all their parking mandates for all their uses citywide. And there are many, many more cities that have done more incremental reforms pretty close to this. This is a pretty high bar to get on this list of 82 cities. So if you're on here, and these are cities from Anchorage, Alaska to Gainesville, Florida, they've got snow, they've got heat. Some of them have transit, some of them don't. Some of them are small, some of them are big. If Dallas did this, you would be the biggest. We track all this on a map. But it's more than parking minimums, right? Getting rid of those minimums, those mandates, those ratios is just this tip of the iceberg, right? It's kind of like if you want to grow a garden in your yard, you don't go throw vegetable seeds in your lawn. You need to remove that grass and rocks and weeds first. But that doesn't make a garden grow. You have to do other stuff. So my main point here is that Dallas should mind its own business when it comes to parking. Don't tell entrepreneurs, builders, tenants, resident tenants and landlords how much parking they need to provide. The city can manage its own asset, the curb, and then that sends an appropriate signal so that people right size the amount of parking they build or purchase. How do you find that right price for the curbs? It's the lowest price that leaves a space open on every block. So you're not gouging anyone. It's a data-driven policy, and it increases in commercial areas, and it increases turnover and access to these areas. So how this looks is, the city manages, they look at an area, and if there's too many people parking, they raise the price of a permit or a meter a little bit. And if there's a lot of occupancy, they lower the price a little bit because you're not trying to gouge, you're just trying to find that Goldilocks spot. Then you take that money and you return it locally, spend it on these things called parking benefit districts. It's a source of revenue for local communities, ideally to direct towards crosswalks or lighting, transit passes, bike lanes, bus shelters. The key here is this can be a way to encourage revitalization. So when activity comes to a community, it's not looked at like a problem, it's an opportunity because those people are coming from another neighborhood and they want to pay you to use your streets, and then you can use that money to make your streets safer or better. So what happens when we do this? The first thing I want to say is look to the past, right? A lot of these reforms are modern. They've happened recently. But you can look back at what was built before 1960, 1950, and look at those streetcar neighborhoods, look at those main streets, look at those communities that people they're very desirable. And that is what you can build again if you have to do more than this, but what is a major stumbling block, get rid of these parking requirements so you can allow those places to be built again. But the main thing is when you do this, it's the same city. I remember when Austin did this, it was like, hey, Austin, did anything change the next day? No, it's pretty much the same city. Those car dependent places, and this is kind of a joke, right? But like really, if you like to drive, or if that's what you're dependent on, you have a parking space at your home. You have a parking space at the shopping center where you go, at your doctor's office. If you already have parking at these places, then you're still going to be able to drive there. No one is being forced to change their lifestyle. And in fact, if you don't like traffic, allowing housing to be built without parking helps more people live in your city without having more cars. So actually, like this is probably net good for people who prefer to drive. So we're not trying to change anyone's lifestyle. But what you do get is a bit more of what you want, in this case, housing, and a bit less of what you don't, traffic and other impacts. Two cities that have done these, Seattle did a parking reform near transit corridors many years ago, and Buffalo was one of the first cities to get rid of their parking mandate citywide in I think 2017, 2018. And what they've seen there is that the majority of new homes that are built in buildings that would not have been permitted under the previous rules, right? That doesn't mean they have no parking. In fact, 70 or 80% of those buildings still have parking with them, but they built more housing than would have been allowed. And part of this is when a developer goes to build something, parking is like a pizza. You can sell it by the slice, but you have to bake it by the pie. So they have to go and build the whole deck or parking garage. They filled out how much parking they can afford. And then they say, okay, well, how much housing are we allowed to build with this? So you're always leaving something on the table housing wise, or not always, but generally. And so one of the main things you see when you get rid of parking mandates is incremental addition to housing in projects that are maybe even already in progress. When we see these rules go away in Oregon, the developer goes back to the planning office and adds a couple, like they change their plans and add a few more homes in exchange for just because it fits in the building. And that's very affordable housing to build because they're already building the building. They're just adding a little more onto it. If you're looking at missing middle or other type of infill reforms, this is really the key. Seattle had an ADU policy. It didn't kick off until they got rid of parking mandates because you just physically can't fit this stuff on the space. And this is very much more recent research, but there's been some looking at where you can build housing in urban areas based on a number of factors without subsidy. And this is not even deeply affordable housing. This is even just like, can you build housing for people who make the average income in your city? And what they found is that getting rid of parking alone has a gigantic impact on the amount of on the amount of housing that you can build. And this is in the general urban area. When you look near transit oriented areas, it goes up even more. These are all slides from Sightline Institute, which is a great partner of ours, and highly recommend if you want to look into that. Almost done here. Finally, one thing is you can unlock your potential when you get rid of these parking mandates. You have all those surface lots around your city, and that means you can allow more activity, more businesses, right? With sharing parking. So if there's a parking lot and already a shopping center, maybe you can have a couple more businesses in there. Maybe the gummed label printer can share its parking with the taxidermist, and it's gonna be okay. And then at night, some people from a nearby apartment might park in that lot too. And this, to reemphasize, does build the kind of base that supports revenue and ridership for better transit in areas where that is wanted and needed. So it's like it's not a chicken and egg. If it is a chicken and egg, you got to put the housing and the people there first, probably, rather than spending all the money. So my recommendations, because I know it was in the what I was gonna, it said I was gonna give some recommendations. My recommendations for Dallas are: get rid of all your costly parking mandates, develop a proactive on-street management program that could be meters, permits, or combined districts. They're doing that in Austin. It's, I think, pretty good. Return those parking revenues to the local community. You can, once you are not requiring parking anymore, then you can say, hey, the parking that you're building voluntarily needs to be EV ready for charging, or it needs to manage the stormwater. If you add those requirements right now onto parking that you're requiring, you're just making everything more expensive. But once you're not requiring parking, you can require more quality parking rather than quantity of parking. And finally, I do know that there are concerns around entertainment, bars, indoor entertainment things. There's more work to be done, right? I think that Dallas probably needs to reform its zoning code a bit to allow for more regulation of nuisances. Right now, parking seems to be used to regulate a lot of things that it shouldn't be. It's kind of like you've got a hammer and everything's a nail. This is something you're going to have to work on, but it's better. I mean, it doesn't make sense to require parking where people go to get drunk. That's just kind of not a good public health safety situation. So go as far as you can. Push your planning commission, push your city council, and plan to keep working on it. People say, whether you get all the way to zero or something. I mean, I'm going to tell you, like a doctor, if you came and asked me, I'm smoking 2 packs a day, I'm cutting back to 1. Is that okay? I would say no. You should have no cigarettes a day. But I understand it's hard to quit smoking and it's hard to get rid of your parking mandates. So just go as far as you can. The logic's on your side. Make people defend these 202 or 220 crazy mandates. That's really what you're talking about, is some nonsense. And that's my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions after we're done.
Thank you, Tony. Now we're gonna go back to Felicity. Has a couple slides that she'd like to present, and these are the Austin perspective, and then we'll open it up for questions after Felicity.
Hey everyone, Felicity Maxwell. I am with one of the urbanist groups here in Austin, Aura, and we worked exclusively on reforming parking here in Austin for about 9 months. And essentially the work had started much before that, but we were really pleased when we got to this big repeal. So I'm here to talk to you from the other side, which is basically what happens after you get rid of these mandates. And the news is it's good. I think the biggest thing I'd like to point out is that we now have this situation in Austin, and you've probably heard that we've done a lot of housing reform here in Austin, partially because we had such high housing prices, and it was sort of seen as this like, let's do everything under the sun, and parking reform was part of that. But because we've taken parking out of the equation when we talk about housing and housing affordability, our conversations are very different. So essentially, I'm a planning commissioner here in Austin. We see zoning cases all the time. The first thing we talk about is not how many parking spaces will be there as a part of this housing. It's not even sometimes anything that's discussed, which may seem like revolutionary, but believe me, when you address parking through parking reform, then you come to this place where you can talk about housing, you can talk about sidewalks, bike lanes, how you access ingress and egress, all these other things. It doesn't just become about the number of spaces, and it doesn't become about what's needed to make the housing work. The housing works, and that parking is secondary. So I really like to think of parking reform as sort of unlocking the real thing you want to talk about, which is how do you get more housing in your city and make it affordable and attainable. And part of that is parking reform, quite honestly. I will also say one of the biggest things I like to talk about is small businesses, because guess what? Your favorite mom and pop shop cannot expand right now. They can't open that second location. They can't add that extra outdoor tables. They can't do those things because of parking requirements. And like we used to see a lot of variance requests and zoning cases that were super tricky and weird because people wanted to say, add a patio, and they didn't have enough parking spaces and they had to figure out how to do it. And I think I want to give a shout out to the Dallas Urbanist who did a great sort of recap of this for you all in your situation, because what they were showcasing there is just the reality in American cities, quite honestly, is small businesses, mom and pops in particular, are particularly harmed by these sort of arbitrary and, shall we say, junk science numbers that Tony talked about, because they are not real. Like the fact that you might need a wine and bar cafe might need 10 spaces, but if you're operating as a restaurant, you only need 7. What's the difference? And I think small businesses are the ones who feel that most directly, because maybe they do want to open that second location, but they can't find a place that has enough parking because of the requirements. So the best thing I've seen in Austin is we see a lot of small businesses that are able to thrive and expand, and they're not going through ridiculous zoning cases to get the type of expansion that they need because they don't have to worry about the parking requirements. The other thing I would have to say is we hear this from our own staff here at the City of Austin is they're so glad they don't have to deal with parking because it is a tricky thing. And especially when you get into those conversations related to variances and zoning cases and whatnot, and do we need to have this many spaces or that many spaces? Does the ADA count? All of that. The parking tables are just a nightmare to deal with on the staff side. And so we have a development services department that has been undergoing a lot of efficiency, sort of trying to make the process of building in Austin streamlined and more accessible. And I would say that getting rid of parking mandates took a huge set of requirements off the table for them as staff members, because they didn't have to double check and triple check everything or go through these complicated cases and present why, again, that wine bar needs 3 extra spaces that the restaurant doesn't. So that I think is really helpful in terms of as you build things in your city, you're allowing your staff to, again, focus on the things that matters, like what does the housing look like? How many are affordable units? What other ways can we improve the streetscape, instead of talking about there has to be 53 stalls and not 54, that kind of thing. And then I will also Tony talked about this briefly, but curb management success. We've just had a tremendous success with this in Austin. Essentially, we set up these parking and transportation management districts. There were a few that we had set up previously in Austin. And then once we reformed parking, we actually have expanded them significantly. And they work exactly as the way Tony described them, which is it allows us to basically collect the revenue using, we have basically an app that you can use, or there's pillars where you can actually go and pay. You put in your license plate, and all that parking revenue basically stays within the district. Well, I should say 51% of it stays within the district, and the other percentage goes to help with parking and parking enforcement in the city. So essentially, we've created this virtuous circle where people have a way to park in the popular areas. They have revenue. Half of that revenue stays in the neighborhood where the parking happens, and we have continuous money to create more parking benefit districts. This was started at UT, and there's actually a whole group of people who get to decide how the money is spent. And so all around UT Austin, if you ever walk around there, you see really nice benches, nice lighting, new sidewalks. That is all paid from our parking benefit district in West Campus, which is right next to UT. So I think there's just great examples of how you can better manage your curb, and it basically becomes a win-win-win for everybody, the neighbors, the city, and the people who actually want to be in and around a popular area of your city. And then I would also say that I think sort of as we've emphasized, as you do this work, you fix one piece of your parking problem and another thing becomes something you can work on. So for example, we did this big repeal and you think, okay, great, Austin's ahead of the curve. We were, but there was still a lot of places where we had a lot of parking that was an issue. One of the biggest ones being downtown. So then we had ULI come and they did a whole study with a bunch of our council members and other stakeholders. And now we have a whole suite of recommendations related to removing additional parking downtown and how to manage that better so that we have a better downtown fabric and less of parking plinths and these huge parking structures that, let's face it, is not great for the urban form. And another one I would say is bike parking. We just recently at our city council had bike parking requirements come to up for discussion, and that whole conversation about how many bike parking spaces we wanted, how we wanted to manage that. All of that is because we're not talking about car parking anymore. We're talking about other types of parking and how we can make the whole infrastructure of parking better in our city. And that means you're not talking about what's already in your code. You're talking about how to fix your code to make your city better. So I think there's just been a really great set of outcomes for us personally. And obviously we're still fairly early, which is why we don't have wonderful graphs like you saw from Sightline. But our understanding is that it's been a real boon, I think, for everybody who works in housing, staff, small businesses, and then just generally generating revenue and curb management. Really, I think everyone feels like where we are now is so much better than where we were pre-2023 when we had all these requirements in place. So that's sort of the big picture outcomes from Austin. And if you want to go to the next slide, yes, there we go, lessons. And I think this actually kind of tracks a lot with what Tony was talking about. And I will say that Tony and his network did a great job working with us when we were going through this process. So they're such a wonderful resource. But, I think there's some big picture lessons that you all have really, I think you're doing all these things already, but I'll just emphasize them again, which is building a coalition, making sure that there's multiple groups saying that these types of mandates hurt the city overall, and having voices from different type walks and parts of the city saying the same thing really makes it clear that nobody's benefiting from having certain minimums that are arbitrary, and that you're saying that in a united way makes it clear that it's not just one group of people impacted, it's the entire city that's impacted. I would also emphasize exactly what Tony said. Let's face it, nobody should be smoking, but if you have some parking minimums and you have to keep some and get rid of some and have to keep others, that's okay. The idea is to continue to iterate and make wins. We started our parking reform actually almost 20 years ago. Really, the first version of it was related to the reforms around UT, where we started to lower parking minimums for students because we knew as they came to UC Austin, they weren't necessarily driving. So some of our earliest reforms started 15 years ago. And we really built on that. And then that's when we worked in, it started in 2023. We had this clear path to getting a full repeal, but that was because of so much incremental reform that had happened previous to that. So y'all are doing great. And don't worry if you don't cut down completely on the smoking or parking minimums. Really, any reduction does help. And as I've emphasized, focusing on the curb, give your staff in Dallas, like City of Dallas should feel like they're empowered to get new technologies or new services to help manage their curbs, because the more you're proactive about curb management, the more you have an answer to what happens if a lot of people park in my neighborhood. Well, we have a way to deal with that. And here's the tools we're giving our city employees. And here's what enforcement is going to look like. And here's how your neighborhood's going to benefit because we're setting up these parking management districts. So having answers to the problems that come from parking is absolutely critical. And then I think, as I said, small business groups, we often talk about housing and housing affordability, and that of course is what the outcome here is that we're all looking for, but really having it clear that it's not just housing affordability, it's really economic development overall. You're just going to see a flourishing of your city if you have different levels, if you take out some of these ridiculous requirements, and that can't happen until you sort of unwind it from your code. And so the more you do this, the more you're going to see people that are happier, like small businesses, community groups, like one of the churches are another key one. Church might want to add, a school or daycare, and they can't do that because guess what? There's parking requirements. So are we really saying that their religious mission is more important than where we put the cars? And that's the kind of thing that you can say that helps people understand, like, oh yeah, it is about housing and housing affordability, but it's also making our communities better. And then I think the way Tony just did, tell the story of excessive parking requirements. This is, like I said, based on stuff that came out of the 50s. It was a very auto-centric time in our country. And we're really trying to move away from that, I think, mostly. Folks understand that having more walkable, integrated neighborhoods, that feel less car-centric is something that everybody wants. So why are we holding on to these ideas that are really outdated in terms of how we want to do our city planning and what we need for our city development? We need to say that these parking requirements are, let's face it, dumb, and that we could be doing so much more for our city, small businesses, for housing affordability, all of it, if we just say we don't need mandates. We need flexibility, and we need to get rid of parking minimums. So those are some the general lessons I would say from Austin. Happy to answer any questions, and thanks for coming tonight and listening to us talk about this really fascinating topic. Right, Tony?
Awesome. Great job, Felicity. Give it up for Felicity for her time. So we've got our little mic stand. That's also kind of the way that they can see you. If you have any questions, you can either stand up where you are and project, or I would encourage you to come closer, like right behind here. And that way both our live stream and our virtual speakers can hear your questions. Daryl, come on down. We're our first speaker.
Hi there. Thank you for your time and your presentation tonight. I've heard a lot of parking reform requests, but mostly from the developer side. Can you all point to examples where you've reduced parking requirements in the neighborhood, and 5 years later, the neighbors in that neighborhood are saying, this was really a good idea and it's being done well, and we're really glad that happened? Or can you point to apartment complexes where they have parking lots with empty spaces and their tenants are not parking on the public street? These sorts of things, that's a part of this discussion I've yet to hear. And I think as a taxpayer, a homeowner, and I will admit where I live is in a townhouse development next to a country club, and we have 7 parking spaces per unit. But we have a lot of entertainment that goes on during the year as well, but nobody blocks anybody else's driveways. So that's my full disclaimer in posing this question to you all.
Tony, do you want to jump in, or I'm happy to answer too?
I mean, I live in a neighborhood that has no parking mandates. That was how I got started. Partly was in my own city here, and actually I got involved because the city had many years ago Portland was one of the first cities to actually do this along transit corridors. So there's a street called Division Street where they said you didn't have to build parking with apartments. And what happened was nothing for 10 years. Very little was built there because the stars have to align to get any development, right? I mean, it's hard to get people to build in a lot of times. You need interest rates, et cetera. So then a number of years went by where very little was done on the street. And then all of a sudden there was a housing boom in the early 2010s. And they started building a bunch of apartments with little to no parking on them. And the neighbors did get very mad. And the neighbors actually got the city to add parking mandates back for a short period of time. And that's kind of how I got started. But what happened was they built all these apartments. And this is one of the hottest restaurant spots in the country. Like this row of restaurants on Division Street in Portland is just booming. Like people, so it's true that there are people in the neighborhood who probably have been inconvenienced because they haven't been able to find as much parking. But ultimately, like that, people didn't move out of that neighborhood, and that neighborhood it's that was a street that was full of car dealerships. It was not a very nice street to walk down. And now it is a very nice street to walk down. So that's a somewhat extreme example. Most likely, what happens is you get a little bit of infill here or there, and it doesn't really change much over time. But even like I said, in the extreme examples, it's usually coming with some benefit. And to your other question around management, I mentioned, city needs to do its business and manage the on-street parking. That's how you kind of deal with spillover rather than requiring it. And it's also true, people have different lifestyles. So it's great if people want to live in a place where they want to provide for a lot of guest parking because they entertain and that's what they do. But there's also just a lot of different people with a lot of different lifestyles. And the key here is, can some of what's built be accommodating different different choices. People who would rather, maybe their friends don't drive, or maybe they prefer, that it's a cost benefit. There's always a trade-off. And so the key here is not to change your lifestyle, but to just allow for other types of building to occur going forward. Felicity?
Yeah, I actually, just to build on that, one of the earliest parking reforms that we did here in Austin was actually related to affordable housing. So basically, if you were doing deeply affordable housing, we really eliminated parking requirements, or made the requirements extremely low. And part of that actually came out of good government spending. Essentially, we, like you all, had passed several affordable housing bonds, and we realized that for affordable housing, people who are in the lower income brackets don't necessarily drive. They often can't afford a car, or they want to be near a transit station because like they use the bus to get to work or whatever that might be. So then it was like, why are we spending all this money requiring parking for developments at affordable housing, deeply affordable housing, where very few people will actually drive or have a car, and like mandating those spaces. And there was a perfect example of this. It was basically a housing development for younger adults coming out of the foster care system, and they built a parking garage along with the affordable housing. And like as Tony explained, that's an expensive, and those were all bond dollars that we were spending. So our Austin taxpayer money was going to build a parking garage because it was required, even though these were kids coming out of foster care and most of them couldn't afford a car. So it just became this really like, why are we doing it this way? And so when we eliminated for affordable housing, exactly that, like there was no pushback because we were matching the needs of the people living in these types of developments with the reality of their car ownership and sort of mobility options. So of course it's good to have some parking options for those people and for those developments, but you didn't need to mandate a whole parking plan, and you could use those excess dollars to build more of the housing. So like then your bond dollars are going to where they should be, which is the housing part, and not to where they shouldn't be, which is the parking plan. So like the garage is not needed, the housing is. That's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing about neighborhood concerns, another great example of our parking management district is South Congress. You all have probably been there if you've ever been to Austin. It's a very popular area. And essentially, separate from this whole conversation about parking minimums, we had done a review. There had been a city review of all of the parking requirements in and around, and there were all these different, like you could park here from 2 to 7. And the consistency of having one benefit district and one set of requirements has been life-changing for the residents, because now they know when their guests can park. They know what's expected in terms of how they can, there's a code they use, how the whole thing works. So essentially, it's actually made their neighborhood parking more efficient and better and less complicated and sort of uncertain for visitors and guests and people who live in the neighborhood. So I think it's been a win-win-win in that sense too. They like these changes because it's made clear who and when they can use the curb around their houses.
Well, before I sit down, am I hearing you say when you reduced the parking requirements, more affordable housing was built as a result in these particular cases?
Yeah, absolutely. If you talk to any affordable housing developer, they'll tell you the more parking that is required, the fewer units that they can build. And as Tony pointed out in his presentation, it basically adds to the rental cost. So essentially makes the affordable housing that you build has to be set at a higher, what they call MFI, median family income. So because you can't, the parking is baked into building the parking makes the project more expensive. So that's the first thing. And then second of all, you're building something that basically isn't necessarily going to be used. So unlike say able to like add a community workroom or something like that, you can't do that because you're using it on car storage. So it makes the developments better, and usually you can build more units because you're not doing the parking.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to see if you could elaborate a little bit more on the shared parking and how that works, because we're trying to develop for an intergenerational development with kids aging out of foster care, and also seniors that are entering into the homeless because of fixed incomes. But there are buildings, businesses around the development that we're seeking. And how does that work with shared parking? I mean, is it kind of the Wild West? You just offer to these other businesses, or are there specific guidelines, and does your city help with that? And I'd like to know how that works in other cities.
Great question. I think, so a lot of times, unfortunately, when there's shared parking provisions, they are regulated by the city. And so there's some sort of like, if you want to reduce the amount of parking you're building in an apartment by leasing a nearby use of a lot, you have to enter into a long-term covenant or an easement. And that makes it almost never works because no one wants to encumber their property like that, right? And then like what happens if someone does build on there? So the key here is first, if you get rid of these mandates and you have this excess parking in the area, it just at least allows a natural market transaction. So that's probably how it would go. I do think I think maybe Sacramento. There are cities, I don't have them on the top of my head, but where I think the city could play a role in facilitating some of that. They could create a clearinghouse, or maybe the developer interest could create a clearinghouse. Sometimes there's like insurance issues, so it can be dependent on the property owner, but just removing those requirements does allow for that to happen, where having the requirements are usually an accessory parking lot can only be used for that lot. And also, if the requirement for the housing is still there. So kind of deregulating this does allow for those arrangements to come into place. So sorry, I don't have a better specific answer there, but might be able to find one through our community if you get in touch.
I would just add that one of the places we've seen shared parking, and I think I sort of saw this highlighted in the Dallas Urbanist video on parking, is when you have different use cases for different times of the day. And a great example of that is in downtown, because basically you might have people who are coming into the downtown area for, say, dinner, to see a concert or movie or something, but they're not the people who park there from 9 to 5 because they don't work there. They're coming in after. So it's like, how can you set up these shared arrangements so that we can reuse those spaces essentially? And I think to Tony's point, it can be tricky for various legal and liability reasons, but if you have the option to have that flexibility and can find someone to facilitate those conversations and sort of help broker agreements that work for both parties, I think it's really fascinating. One of the things that we found out when we started talking about downtown parking requirements in Austin was that actually increasing valet spaces is great, because valets usually can come up with, like, they find a parking garage nearby that's empty, that's close to where they're dropping off the cars, and then use that parking space because maybe it's used during the day by workers. So valet companies are really good at finding excess parking and using it for the specific period that they need. What they often have trouble doing is having a valet drive-in spot, like where you can actually pull up to the valet. And so what we have facilitated in downtown is to put in more specific valet areas near our entertainment districts. Because guess what? If you can pull your car in and the valet is only $5, and then they go find that parking space for you, that serves everybody, right? So it's like sometimes the how the shared parking space works is just requires a little bit of facilitation or cooperation. That can be tricky to work out, but I think to Tony's point, it's definitely worth exploring, because then you're reusing those parking spaces versus only having them empty and unused because it's outside of the normal use of that particular parking space, if that makes sense.
Hi there. I have a question on parking studies. So full disclosure, I'm not from Dallas, I'm from Denton, and I'm rooting for all of you, but I'm also hoping that we win and get to the end of the race soonest. In my estimation, which could be wrong if you tell me, parking studies are often started either because the organization or city that is involved wants to do the right thing and needs justification for it, or because they are scared of the fight and wants to delay it until it dies. My 8-ball is not good enough to figure out what that is. Are there any best practices as far as community or political organizing on how to take advantage of parking studies once they are released in order to make things go the right direction?
Do you have something, Felicity?
No, go ahead, Tony, because I was going to say, I'm going to let the organizer talk first.
Got it. So I think, I think one key is invariably, parking studies usually tend to show that there is parking, like that the situation is not as bad as people believe. A lot of people, they drive down the main street, they see that, or their block has some parking congestion, but usually what they end up showing is that nearby there is plenty of parking, or if they do off street, if they're able to do off street on street, usually there shows that there's an abundance of parking. The areas that really have parking congestion, particularly chronically, like all the time, are usually probably not that much. And everyone knows where they are, and that's why, just charging a little bit for on street or something is a good way to manage that. I think I think your point is probably correct in that, people are doing a parking study because they're required to, or they're trying to prove a point. I mean, but also like it's a good idea. Like parking studies aren't bad because you want to. That's part of how the bank might require it. I mean, that's one thing to remember is that these requirements are just one piece. They're like the most ridiculous and indefensible piece of this. But in order to build something with a lot less parking, the stars kind of have to align. You need a developer that wants to do it. You need a bank that's willing to lend. You need investors that are okay with that. You need a broker or a realtor that's willing to work with them. You need a place that makes it work. So a lot of times I think a parking study can be used to, just show that area. So we've done some stuff like where we've suggested that community groups like can conduct kind of their own parking study. And nowadays you can do that. You can even just walk down the street, with a camera a couple of times a day and just kind of show. You don't even need to really count the cars, but just show where, hey, I walked down the street and there's some parking around the corner. So it's an important part. Knowing your occupancy is also an important part of adjusting those rates. So I don't know if they're so bad, but they do expire in time too. So that's one thing. A lot of times you'll have a parking study done, city will spend a bunch of money and then it won't make its reforms. And then 5 years later, it's just right back on the consultant train. So like, I do think, if you're going to do one, be ready to act, know what you're going to do with it. And, I'd say maybe try and get this, if we're going to do a parking study and it shows that there's some available parking, then are you committed to actually doing something? Might be a word of advice. I'll stop there because I don't really have a ton more.
No, it's so funny. This is exactly what I was going to say. Let's face it, we're all in this room because parking is political. Like you have to get politicians and policymakers on board with making changes because it is kind of ingrained in our city and urban fabric right now. So when you do a parking study, I think the biggest thing is to say you want it to be actionable and like make that actionable with a timeline is ideal, but like just at least have something feels like it's you can take to a city council member and say, hey, we did this parking study and here's what it showed us. And I think that that's a little bit what happened with our downtown parking is that we could show comprehensively, because we've done several of these now, that downtown Austin is excessively overparked. So then it stopped being like, oh, we need to look at this problem. It became, what are we doing about this problem? And so I think that's where I would also say is parking cities can definitely be the enemy and they can be a delay tactic. But if you really ensure that there's good actionable outcomes or really encourage that as the direction, and then you take those outcomes to somebody, a policymaker, a key seated leader who has empowered to maybe do something about it. I think that's when they stop being as useless and time wasting and more like, oh, I can actually leverage this in a way to help us get to where we're trying to go.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. I have a quick question. In a world without mandates, who's making the decision of how many parking spots is appropriate?
I mean, yeah, great. I mean, the people with skin in the game is ultimately the answer. I mean, the key here is, for one, they're already like a lot of times people will still, even in Austin, I mean, even in Dallas, build above the parking requirement, right? So like there's already evidence that there's a range of parking that they'll provide. Without the mandates, it's a calculus of, what the builder or the entrepreneur in this case thinks they need to provide for their tenants or customers and what the community is willing to pay for that parking space. So you're really kind of opening that up. The key here is there on-street parking that is distorting that decision, right? If there's free on-street parking nearby, well then the first people who are making the decision after the mandates go away have an incentive to build less because they know that they can spill that over. So it is really key to convince your city to have a plan. And the good news is the logic and the plan is not that hard. It's, you look at how, this is a valuable thing that is in finite supply, you charge a little bit for it probably, or you have other restrictions for it. So I think that's the key. But maybe to your point too, a bank like larger developers, especially people who are building bigger buildings, they have like a formula, and that formula tells them how, or a retailer, a large box retailer, like they know exactly how much parking that they supposedly need from, like Target's gonna have like they've got their own internal table. So when they go looking for retail, they're gonna maximize that, which is why this actually is a policy that really benefits smaller businesses and local developers, because those are the people who are going to be willing to take a chance and build a little less or be a little less formulaic. So in the absence of that, it's really probably just like what works for that business, like what have they adapted to and how do they build their buildings is what's going to decide how much parking they build.
Well, and one follow-up question. So in a world without mandates, have you seen people do guidelines? Because like one thing I could see maybe being troubling is like if you get into a situation where you have bureaucrats sort of bickering about how much parking you need in a situation, and they may be arbitrary and maybe want to increase the cost or make it difficult. So now they have full reign to sort of say whatever they want to make it more difficult to develop or less difficult to develop, depending on who's running the show. So I'm curious if you've seen that play out, or if people have used guidelines to sort of keep, people in check. And that's my last question.
I mean, I will just say that my understanding is that banks and financing institutions have those guidelines as well. Like they do care about making sure that there's enough parking access for people to be able to come to the retail center or, multifamily housing. So you taking it away from the city bureaucracy, to your point, does not mean that there's not bureaucracy around parking. There always is. The question is like who's in charge and who's making that call. And I think to Tony's point, what we've seen in Austin is that developers and banks and financing institutions are more willing to be flexible and less rigid, and maybe so they have some guidelines, but they're not as tied to them because the mandates aren't there, and because they think, oh, we could try a Target with maybe 100 less spaces. And like we've seen some developments that I think wouldn't have penciled, quite honestly, if the parking mandates had still been there, because they were like, well, we can't fit it on this piece of land if we have to do 200 spaces. But because we don't have to do the 200 spaces, it fits on the piece of land with 100, and therefore the costs are lower, and maybe there's a little bit less parking, but we think that this is still going to work. So you see that kind of risk reward calculation happening, I think, in a way that you don't when the rules are there, because the rules make it easy for everybody to say, oh, this is how many you have to have, and like those are the rules. But if you take the rules away, other people do get to be in charge, but I think you can put them in charge in a way that the flexibility is encouraged versus discouraged, quite honestly. And I also will say that I was going to quip to your first question, is that as a planning commissioner, I no longer get to decide how many parking spaces are needed. And that's actually a really good thing, because, I'm a volunteer and I might know a lot about how land use should work in the city of Austin. I have no idea how many parking spaces a Target should actually require. So let's just say that the reform usually makes it so that people who have skin in the game, banks, other people, developers, they get to make these decisions versus it being made by a random person on a Tuesday night at a zoning meeting.
And I think I'll just add, I think that you have if you end up in a situation where the developer or the builder is negotiating over something for different reasons, I mean, obviously parking might still come as part, like, there's things that become political. At least in this case, the discussion starting from an area where, it's starting from zero and not from some other number where they're trying to jack that up and down. And I remember when I first came to Dallas to talk a couple years back at a little party, a developer told me that they know of, or one of the, is either a developer or a staff person told me that they know of situations in Dallas where the developer will ask for a parking reduction, take up all that staff time. They'll grant them the reduction, and then the developer will still actually build the amount of parking that they were supposed to build under the regulation, just because they wanted to be able to tell the bank that they were building more than was required. So I think there's some weird stuff that goes on. And if you get rid of these requirements, it kind of like, it might not be immediate, but it does allow for some of this insanity to kind of go away over time and get back to what we're actually trying to do, which is build great places to live and have, prosperity.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm Matt with Dallas Neighbors for Housing. We've been speaking in front of the City Plan Commission for the past couple months, trying to get parking reform passed here. To mixed reviews, I'll say, and I was wondering if either of you who have gotten parking reform passed in various cities, what were the strategies that worked? Was it a critical mass of speakers? Was it behind the scenes conversations with various commissioners? Any tips you might have? Thanks.
Well, I'll jump in first with this one because I think that there's a kind of a three-pronged thing that I would suggest. So, first of all, it does matter, honestly, and I just said it, parking is political. Like, it does matter who is up there making these decisions, your council members, your planning commissioners. So, having a sense of who might be more supportive of the liberalization or, getting rid of mandates versus people who might not, and having those conversations before you really start to see the actual reforms is important. It sounds like you guys have already been doing that outreach work, because I will say that, like, we had some skeptics in Austin, and then over time you're able to win them over. So I think the first thing is starting those conversations early and figuring out who your allies might be, who can really help you. Two, I do think that those background conversations with specific groups. So for example, in East Austin, there's a lot of churches that might want to expand but couldn't because of, so like we maybe had our faith leaders go and talk to their council member and say, hey, I'd like to do XYZ with my church parking lot, but I can't because of parking requirements. So like, I think sometimes it's about having people within that same district who are not necessarily, being, of course, housing affordability and sort of the typical people who show up to talk about this are great, but sometimes a conversation with a community leader who is being forced to or restricted in what they can do, that really turns a light bulb off for a lot of political leaders, I would say. And then the last thing I will say is telling your stories. Absolutely, at planning commission, at city council, we know that there are so many people, and I actually love that Tony has that slide in there now about people who can't drive, because let's face it, when they hear you have these meetings, the people who show up drove there and have cars, maybe have 3 cars. Maybe they're like big garages, whatever. The point is the people who are not represented at these meetings are often the people who benefit the most from a reduction in parking requirements, because you end up with better housing, better transit access, everything, because they're not being mandated to drive cars, which they can't have or don't access or don't use for a variety of reasons. So making sure that you're giving a voice to the people who don't necessarily drive cars and aren't necessarily represented by the loudest voices in the room, I think is really critical, because again, that helps the leader, those folks up there making these decisions to say, hey, I just heard from a disabled rights activist saying they prefer if we had less parking or more ADA spaces because we had less mandates, so you can really frame this in a way that it becomes clear that the people who drive everywhere are not the ones who should be the overwhelming voice. There are many people out there who have different lifestyles and live in different ways, and you're trying to make sure that they're represented in these conversations.
That's excellent advice, particularly around stories and case studies. I will add some organizing kind of thoughts here, which is one thing is I just find most people don't know, right? Like most people don't know how much it costs, how much space it takes up, what the bad impacts are, and why it's there, which these stupid rules, like people don't know. And I think so one thing is when people are defending this, like ask them, like, how do you defend this sewage treatment plant thing? Like this, it's rotten all the way down, right? It's not, there's none of these that are based on like that are better or worse. And there's no good way to calibrate this. There's a great paper by Professor Shoup called like the pseudoscience of parking mandates. I recommend looking that up. It's on our website. It's a great one. And from an organizing perspective too, one thing is you're not trying to necessarily don't fight with people directly so much. I mean, like, you're not gonna, don't try to convince someone who's opposed to this necessarily that it's correct, because the fact is that for every person that's really opposed to this, especially after hearing some basic information, there's like 9 people who just haven't thought about it and that you can bring somewhat on your side. Or, people are kind of like, the knee jerk, if you ask someone, hey, should there be more parking? Of course, they're going to say yes. But once you tell them this, a lot of people soften their approach. And so they're just less likely to come out in opposition because they've received a little bit of education. And then the last thing I think is useful in a situation where you're really there is to kind of press and question, just be curious about what people are actually worried about. Like, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Do you really think someone is going to come in and build a big apartment building at the end of a rural road with no infrastructure? And then what? Is someone going to do that? And if they did it, I mean, okay, they're going to lose money. And is someone else going to follow and do it again? I mean, like, I guess if what is the concern? What are we really worried about? And what is the real solution to that problem? What are the actual problems people are worried about? Because a lot of times parking is a proxy for other stuff. And if you can dig in and get them to admit that parking mandates aren't really the right solution for what they're trying to fix, either maybe they might not want to keep making the argument, or you can offer solutions that are sensible and logical. So I think, like, that's some of my organizing advice, is really just dig in, okay, well, what happens then? Because, like, a lot of this is just people are thinking way in the future, and it takes a long time for cities to change. And I think you can handle that. People are smart. Your city staff are committed. People care about their communities, and you can make things work if but the main problem is that right now you can't get good outcomes because the rules are stacked against the kind of place you want. So the first thing is stop digging and let things happen that you like. And right now we're kind of in this backwards thing where we don't do that.
Yeah, and I would just add, because I should have put this in my slide, is like the city staff and city planners, the city's your friend in this process, because regardless of what happens, you get rid of some mandates, you get rid of a few, whatever happens, you need to help with curb management. So the whole thing is like, let's help the city do a better job with this thing called parking. And like, let's make better rules, let's make better management. But that requires you to have a good relationship with folks who are actually going to do that work. And that might be in your transportation department, it might be in your city planning department, it may be on your planning commission. So like making everybody feel like, hey, this is something I can be a part of and like okay with, versus them feeling like, oh, I'm getting yelled at because I don't like, I want to keep a certain number of parking spaces. Like, that doesn't help anybody. The city buy-in has to be there. And then that actually, I think, lets you get to better outcomes. So yeah, just keeping it positive and really seeing the city and helping the city become a better actor around parking and supporting that effort is really critical, because then they see it as a partnership that has a chance to, as Tony says, get better instead of worse. So like, if you're on a third date, let's try to get to marriage, not, we're not talking to each other anymore.
Hi, really enjoyed the presentation. So one thing that I gather is that it sounds like the, kind of the end goal is that, we densify these corridors and activate, unused space, and then we connect it all through transit. In your experience, kind of how long does it take for those transit options to become available? Is that another kind of prolonged fight that you've heard of or seen or been a part of in Austin?
Oh, well, I would say something about the current administration, but I'm going to try and keep this upbeat. Speaking of positive, so our Austin is in the process of planning our first light rail. So you guys are ahead of us because you already have DART. We're planning Project Connect, and I will tell you right now that our Project Connect is probably first trains is 10 years from now. So yeah, we've got a long time before the kind of rail transit infrastructure comes in. But what I will say is that as part of what we've seen with improving transit options is that we are trying to do a better job with the resources we have now. And that includes things like increasing bus frequency, really trying to make sure that we have high frequency networks where the most people live. And I think to your bigger point is like, as we're encouraging people to do car free, what does it look like if it's just not transit? So in Austin, there's a big effort around urban trails and sidewalks, pedestrianization. And I think Tony kind of touched on this in his presentation, but when you don't require as much parking, everything becomes much more walkable. So then if you are using your parking dollars from your, neighborhood parking plan to pay for better sidewalks, you don't necessarily feel like you have to drive to the grocery store that's 5 minutes away, because there is a safe bikeway or a safe sidewalk, and it feels like, oh, this is fun. We can go to the grocery store and, stop by the park on the way, something like that. So, and like one of the most popular things we've done in Austin is what we call safe routes to schools. And that allows kids to basically bike and walk to school. So we understand it as a holistic thing. we love to have trains in Austin already. We don't, sadly, and we're gonna have to wait a little while till we do have them. But in the meantime, what can we do to encourage car-free living or car-light living as much as possible? And I think that's a place where we've really seen a lot of success, and that can be bolstered by the revenue you have in these parking benefit districts, and just, you know, rethinking how you, to Tony's point, don't encourage the car driving, encourage the other forms of transportation and mobility.
And I'll also add the places that are most car dependent are very like, you know, they usually have a lot of space already accommodating car. They're overparked often. That's why, partly why they're car dependent and why there's not good transit access. So there's a lot of slack in the system to allow incremental densification, incremental infill, where people will still probably drive, right? Like, you know, when they build apartments with no parking, yeah, one of the things is 70% of the people that in Portland, 70% of the people that moved in these apartments still had a car. Well, that was fine. They were parking them on the street. And why would they get rid of them if they moved there? But at the same time, 30% of the people in the apartment not having a car was a lot better than the rest of the neighborhood. That was a major improvement. That is a pent up demand potential for supporting that transit. And that's what I mentioned, you know, when Felicity mentions a 10-year time horizon to get the transit there, that's why, I mean, it takes, you know, it could take 2 years to build an accessory dwelling unit, a mother-in-law cottage. It could take, you know, it could take a long time to build that apartment building. So you do want to get these rules where you're allowing things in the pipeline so that people can actually build that ahead of time. And then, you know, there's also incremental levels of transit. So not everything has to be light rail. There are other options, and there are other options for transportation. And the last thing I'll mention is this isn't only about connecting places with transit, right? You can connect places with transit. You can allow more housing near the places where they would want to go, right? That's transit-oriented development where, you know, like you build or in downtown area infills. And then you can also, this is where we talked about business development and maybe trying to allow more Felicity mentioned this more. This is around the walkability, but really bringing destinations to where people live, where they have a lack of, like they're in food deserts, right? So people might be, you might say, oh, we can't build an apartment here because we're transit dependent and the transit's not good and people don't have a grocery store. Okay, well, maybe the solution is not actually to run a bus line from their place to a grocery store that's 5 miles away, but to create an environment where you can incrementally support food purchase options in that area. And you can look to Monty Anderson's developments in South Dallas and Duncanville. Like he does this. There are examples of how you can take communities and kind of retrofit them in place. And that's, I think, like a really good model that looks to, like, you know, shorter term incremental horizons for changing for how this works or can work.
Any other final questions? 7:25, last question. All right, cool. So we will wrap up with some closing announcements and next steps for you. Oops. Sorry, Instagram. They're okay. Dallas right now is currently working on this, as mentioned, the City Plan Commission. If you go to bit.ly/CPC dash comment or scan that QR code on screen, you can go ahead and send a comment to the City Plan Commission. Let them know whether or not you're supportive of the current NOAC recommendation, which is for a full elimination of the city parking mandates for all uses. There are compromises that are being considered, so we might not get the full elimination, but we're working through what those negotiations could be. But keeping that strong standpoint, like Tony said, it's not like we just want to quit smoking to one pack a day. We could quit altogether if we had the political will. So if you all, 20 plus people who are here today, able to come out, I'll leave this open a little bit longer. If you need that QR code, again, it's the City Plan Commission comment form online. Next Thursday, February 13th, is the next City Plan Commission meeting. It starts at 9 in the morning. Hopefully they take public speakers at the very beginning of that meeting so you can get on with the rest of your day. The deadline to speak virtually is 3 p.m. the day before, Wednesday, February 12th. So we can keep you updated on the progress of the speakers if you do decide to speak. But it's really impactful. The more speakers we have, the more diverse perspectives who are able to come out to what we call Pack City Hall we can give you one of our shirts. We have a few for pickup in the back. This does go a long way in making our city plan commission hear the voices of those who are not represented, people who don't have the privilege or the agency to come to City Hall on a Thursday morning. If you can, please try and come or send a comment in support of those parking reforms that are being considered. We'll have our next event for the coalition likely in April. We're looking at doing a city council candidate forum and then potentially having another event in late May or early June. So we'll keep you updated on how that progresses. But if you're not already, please follow the Dallas Housing Coalition on our social media channels. Or become a member at DallasHousingCoalition.com. There's no cost or commitment in becoming a member. You can sign up as an individual or an organization at the bottom of our homepage, and we'll keep you updated on our internal and external communications from here. Our motto is Dallas is big enough for everyone. This is something that we stand by. We think Dallas is big, and that's kind of our mantra, and it's true. We know that we have opportunity for all to thrive here, given that opportunity, but we have to fight for the Dallas and the vision that we want to see for our city. So thank you again for coming out tonight on a Tuesday. We appreciate you. We hope to see you at our next Dallas Housing Coalition event. Please have a great night and stay safe. Tony, Lindsay, can we share your slides or contact information if you're still there?
What about it?
Can we share slides and contact information? We had some people ask about that.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
please. Yes, absolutely.
I'll
Um,
get you a
yeah.
PDF of mine.
Okay. Just send
Yep.
them.
All
I'm
right.
gonna stop the live stream. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.